Well, hello, everybody. We're really excited to be here with you today, talking about the intersection of race and racial trauma. We want to highlight that neither Fiona nor I identify as Pacific Islander. However, we have worked with the community for many years. But before we get into our presentation today, I wanted to share with you a little bit more about our individual backgrounds.
So we'd like to share some of our identities because it's really important when we're doing this work and having these conversations, holding these spaces, that we recognize the many identities that and experiences that we've had and how they impact how we move through society. So just some of the identities and experiences that I've had are reflected by the images on this screen. There are two flags, a Jamaican flag and an American flag. I'm a first generation Jamaican American. Folks in my family range from being completely undocumented to being naturalized citizens. And so growing up, I was impacted by and saw firsthand how immigrants, particularly those without documentation, are oppressed in this society. Having said that, I'm a US citizen, and there's a lot of power and privilege in that identity because I can't be removed. Underneath the US flag, you'll see scales of justice. I'm an attorney barred in New York and Washington, D.C. And even though I don't practice currently, the ability to put ESQ behind my last name gives me a lot of power and privilege in this society. That identity is particularly valued. To the left of that, you'll see a Big Apple. I'm a native New Yorker from the South Bronx in New York City. And that community is primarily Black and Brown. Higher rates of poverty, higher rates of crime, higher rates of drug use, but also higher rates of love and support. That made me the person I am today. And to the left of that, you'll see a very outdated picture of my family. I'm married to a cisgender white male who is an immigrant from Europe. So we often have conversations around white male privilege, around the fact that he is assumed to belong, even though he is an immigrant, whereas others who are not immigrants in this society are assumed to be perpetual foreigners. Our children are half Black, half white, biracial. My eldest identifies as a Black woman with a white father. Jess?
Hi, so I'm Jess, and I'm a first generation immigrant. I was born in Hong Kong and immigrated to the US when I was about 4 years old, essentially because we were a colony of Great Britain, and my parents were afraid of what would happen when that colony was returned to China. Grew up in New York City. My parents worked in blue collar jobs. So my dad cleaned the commercial kitchens of restaurants, and my mom was a seamstress. I was the first in my family to go to college, also learned English in school, took ESL classes, and became the de facto interpreter for both of my parents. And it's a role I still play to this day. My current family, I'm currently located in Oakland, and my partner is a community organizer in Oakland, Chinatown. We also have two dogs, one of whom is a pandemic puppy and is requesting to sit on my lap right now because he wants to participate. But with that said, just very briefly about Healing Equity United. So Fiona and I came together about 12 years ago working for a DC nonprofit that served Pacific Islanders, focusing on domestic violence, sexual assault, and trafficking issues. However, throughout the course of our career in domestic violence, we have realized that there are very few people in leadership positions, very few people who make decisions about grants that essentially look like the people that we are serving. And so we came together to help organizations shift their cultures to really be less, to be more anti-racist and more anti-oppressive. And so our session for today, so we're going to talk a little bit about how racialized trauma intersects with trauma from violence and what the impact is on the individual and the community. We'll also identify some positive coping and healing practices that you all can engage in and discuss and strategize actions. We'll give you an opportunity to be able to talk to one another.
So we like to start this conversation and ground the conversation in this quote. Trauma creates change you don't choose. Healing is about creating change that you do choose. And so we truly believe that in order to heal as communities of color, as advocates of color, we have to recognize how racialized trauma shows up, not only in our personal lives, but in our communities, and how it also impacts the work that we do as service providers. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what trauma is. I know that most of y'all in the room are advocates, so I'm not going to give you the nitty-gritty neurobiology of trauma. I'm just going to say that for the purposes of today's conversation, trauma is going to be defined as a natural response to extremely distressing or disturbing events, right? So we're not going to try to categorize it in any other kind of medical framework. It's just a natural response to disturbing events. Now, you all know that there are a variety of different types of trauma that we have to be aware of. There's the physical type of trauma, and in our work, that is most seen in terms of intimate partner violence, right? There's also the form of environmental trauma. And depending on where you live in the country, for example, on the West Coast, there are seasonal fires, right? And those who have to flee a catastrophic fire event hold that trauma, hold the pain of having to pack up a few belongings and flee for safety. There's intergenerational trauma, right? And so when I first got into the sector, more than 20 years ago at this point, I was a little skeptical about intergenerational trauma, right? Like, how do we really hold trauma in our bodies and then pass it along to our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren? But the data is out there, and it shows that those of us who are impacted by varied types of trauma and haven't sufficiently healed from that trauma, pass it along to the next generation. It's in our DNA. There's political and societal trauma, those who are experiencing what's happening in the Ukraine right now, right? Experiencing societal political trauma. And then for advocates, particularly, there's vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. We are all familiar with that, right? Hearing stories again and again, and then internalizing those painful narratives and holding them. What's not talked about as often is what we're going to be talking about next, and that's racialized trauma or racial trauma. Now, this refers to a mental and emotional injury caused by encounters with racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racism, hate crimes, etc. Right? And you can see by, well, you can imagine by this definition, it is a definition and a naming of experiences and that weight that we feel, right? Or we felt, and we couldn't name it. We couldn't wrap our brains around it, and we were gaslighting ourselves. Did that really happen? Should I really be feeling this way? And by naming this experience, it says to us all, right? Yes, it is real. It is not just in your head, right? There is a substantial impact that you hold when you are the target of varied types of oppression based on race.
So what we want to think about is what happens when we combine trauma from both domestic violence as well as racial trauma, because that's a form of compounded trauma, right? So I'm sure you all are familiar with the cycle of abuse and the cycle of abuse that survivors go through, right? Starting with tensions, and then there's an incident, whether it's violent or some sort of explosion, then there's some sort of reconciliation, and then there's calmness afterwards, right? And so as Fiona and I were doing this work over the last couple of decades, we realized that not only is this cycle of abuse applicable for domestic violence survivors, but it is also applicable to survivors who identify as part of the global majority, also known as Black, Indigenous, people of color, which also includes Pacific Islander, as well as Asians and Latinx folks. And so what I want to show you next is something that we developed at Healing Equity United. And this is essentially a wheel. This wheel may look somewhat familiar to you because it is a power and control wheel. And so what we discovered is that in looking at this wheel, that there were certain aspects that survivors who are part of the global majority face. And so, for example, I'll start at the top right, and then I'll have Fiona talk a little bit about the left side. And so survivors of the global majority may sometimes experience racial violence that results in racial trauma at work. And so that might be feeling unsafe because of the way that their white supervisor looks at them, gestures, actions that are taken at the time. They may hang up signs in their cubicles or their offices that might reinforce white culture, values, and power. And then there might be emotional abuse that Pacific Islander staff may be feeling. So whether it's name calling, purposefully mispronouncing names, even though you've corrected them, using the wrong pronouns, humiliating individuals, making them feel like they're a burden on the workplace if they ask for something culturally specific for survivors. They might also have their concerns minimized and their concerns not taken seriously, denying that any incidents that might feel like discrimination or bias might have not occurred, or they might have blamed that staff person for what happened to them. There may also be issues of isolation where there is, restricting access, such as not allowing individuals to attend certain meetings or providing that seat at the table where their voice can be heard. And so Fiona, can you go over the left side of the wheel, maybe starting from the top around psychological abuse?
Yes, thank you, Jess. And so members of the global majority often experience the psychological abuse of being spoken over. It's as if you didn't have your mouth open at all, right? Being interrupted or challenged, right? Or having your expertise undermined or questioned. It's this experience of being coerced or threatened, right? If you raise issues regarding to a need for cultural competency and humility, more likely because we're shifting away from cultural competency, cultural accessibility, and then being told, if you keep raising those issues, you're going to be brought up on a performance evaluation, performance improvement plan, right? A PIP, right? You're going to be retaliated against. When employers using a top-down decision-making, and we acknowledge and know that many nonprofits are mostly led by white leadership, right? That top-down leadership and decision-making model often excludes folks of the global majority, right? And so there is a lack of integration of folks' ideas, perspectives. You can also be blackballed in the community and the sector that you work in. And finally, economic abuse, right? What's the ultimate threat? When you raise these issues, you could be fired. You can lose you lose your income, right? Or have your shift significantly reduced? Jess?
Yeah, so I want to take a moment and just pause here to talk about some of the racial trauma that Pacific Islander folks face and how it might also show up in the workplace or tie into some of the things or be compounded by what happens in the workplace. So Fiona, can you talk a little bit about like the history of colonization and militarization that's led to, for example, traditional languages being endangered? What's the racial trauma around that? And how might it show up?
Yeah, there's a significant history around that. And well, we don't have enough time to get into the long history of it, but it may show up in the workplace in that um, folks who identify as Pacific Islander and are doing this work and would like to raise, for example, how racialized trauma, and in this example, intersects with intergenerational trauma. And so we may need to change our service provision in order to provide more accessible and appropriate services, and then being told, what does that have to do with anything? That happened a long time ago. This is 2022. No, that's not best practice, right? So being spoken over, being rendered invisible, not having your history acknowledged and valued, and not recognizing the intersection between intergenerational trauma, racialized trauma, and the need for a certain type of service provision. I hope that answers your question, Jess.
Yeah, I also want to talk a little bit because about 10 years ago, we partnered with the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C. to talk about the importance of disaggregating Asian and Pacific Islander data, right? So we know that when we don't disaggregate, that the numbers are severely skewed for the Pacific Islander community. And so how might that show up, with this wheel in the workplace? I mean, I can give one example and then, Fiona, if you can just share some extras, right? So for example, I can see this coming up a lot of times, minimizing, denying, and blaming, because we know that a lot of nonprofit organizations have been governed and run through the lens of like white culture and white supremacy. And so I can imagine, employers saying, for example, that, well, the data doesn't show, the API data doesn't show X, Y, and Z, right? Even though, because those numbers are not disaggregated. What are some other examples that you can think of, Fiona?
Thank you, Jess, for raising that. And I want to pause there because it's, for me, particularly frustrating that we did this data dive in partnership with the Urban Institute more than a decade ago, identifying the need for crafting data and evaluative tools that can really draw out and identify the need of the API community, and particularly of the Pacific Islander community, because their numbers were being lost in the whole. And the fact that we're still speaking about this more than a decade later, it aggravates me to no end, and it's completely mind-boggling. But some other ways that this may show up, right? So in terms of funding, right? Funders saying there is no need to provide XYZ services, right? Whereas people are still calling us, people are still showing up at our organizations, people are still going to shelter, right? But the data, which hasn't been disaggregated, doesn't verify or validate a need for sufficient funds to be allocated to doing this work, right? Again, rendering an entire community invisible, requiring that an entire community fend for itself, right? And always being caught up at a loss, right? Because you're always trying to, you know, I was going to use a Jamaican term, but like put two pennies together and make a dollar. That's what we're basically trying to do. I hope that helps, Jess.
Yeah, I also want to highlight, so this is something that's kind of specific to Oakland. So in East Oakland, we have a good number of Pacific Islanders. And oftentimes, our Pacific Islander brothers and sisters face violence at the hands of the police just as often as our Black brothers and sisters in East Oakland. And sometimes they are told that they're not people of color. And so when we're told that we're not people of color, that oftentimes actually triggers an additional form of racial trauma. Because not only are we continuing to be invisibilized, but we are also facing the same types of violence. And so I think what Fiona and I are trying to share is that it's really important to think about how all of these traumas compound so that we're able to really discuss how are we going to have that healing component. And so Fiona and I also wanted to share with you this solidarity wheel, because we believe that there are certain things that we can do in the workplace, essentially to address some of these traumas that might show up. And so, for example, I'll just do the right side of the wheel, and my colleague Fiona can talk about the left. And so non-threatening behavior, right? Like, how do we foster brave spaces, talking and acting so that our Pacific Islander staff feel comfortable expressing themselves? How do we provide respect by actively listening to them, accepting feedback for when we cause harm? For how do we make sure that we're pronouncing their names correctly? Developing trust and support as a culture in our organization. So ensuring that we're supporting their professional goals, respecting their rights to their feelings, and recognizing that racial trauma and healing. And then in terms of isolation, like providing opportunities for BIPOC to lead and participate in high stakeholder discussions and meetings, particularly if they are from the community that you're trying to serve. So I do, before I move on, I do see a question in the chat, and I thought I would just take a pause here for us to discuss it, if that's okay with you, Fiona. So Robert asked in the chat, why PIs in East Oakland are told that they're not people of color. So Fiona, why do you think that is?
Well, we don't have enough time for the long answer, right? But I think it's about the Oppression Olympics. I think it's about our community, that being the community of members of the global majority, having internalized narratives of white supremacy that says that group, they're not as oppressed as that group. And therefore, we're not going to accept you as members of our club. So, for example, Black folks or Latinx folks considering the Pacific Islander community in Oakland and saying, no, your proximity to whiteness excludes you from being called BIPOC. And that is, at least from my perspective, the short answer to a great question.
So is it just a derogative statement? It's not necessarily like in policy or anything like that.
It's not in policy. It's essentially it's a statement that is harmful for PI folks, and if we were to kind of look more deeply into it, it is to the Oppression Olympics that Fiona mentioned, as well as the racial trauma that Black folks face.
Okay, I get it. I just thought it was something like when the cops came or something, that they said that like you're not categorized as people of color, but it's just I understand now.
Yeah. So it's other people in the community, not the cops.
I see.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, and Bella also highlighted another example of what happens in the workplace because of white privilege. And so, Fiona, do you want to talk about the left side of the wheel?
Yeah, thank you, Jess. And so we know that if we're going to start shifting our cultures and how we do domestic violence work and how we engage and support survivors, we have to create true cultures of belonging. And that includes being able to hold each other accountable for when harm takes place, right? For when I tell my Pacific Islander colleague that they don't face oppression because they are not BIPOC, right? How do we have spaces in our organizations that support honest and nuanced conversations in which I would be held accountable for saying that? Not shamed, not isolated and blamed, but held accountable. These communities and cultures that we're trying to create in the sector would also include shared leadership, because we know that the current, and as we talked about a few moments ago, the current models of leadership often don't include folks of the global majority. And so if we can't change that dynamic overnight, we're going to have to at least shift the way leadership looks and to change it into one that is shared leadership and also shared responsibility. The culture that we are talking about here doesn't fall on any one person's shoulders. It is all of our responsibilities, regardless of our race, regardless of our ethnicity, regardless of our ability, and the role that we have within an organization. And let's see. Having transparent economic decision-making, right? And having that be based on the value you bring because of your lived experience, being paid for that extra skill you have for speaking XYZ language, for having ABC lived experience in the community and being paid for that, right? Oh, don't get me started. Jess, go on.
Yeah, so before we move to actually talking about radical healing, I do want to address Bella's question in the chat because I think it's relevant to what's on this slide. And so how do we hold leaders accountable? Because you see these behaviors from top leadership as well, right? So Fiona's my calling in person, or our calling in person at Healing Equity United. So I'm gonna let Fiona take this question.
So just to frame what Jess just posed, from our perspective as an organization, we suggest that there are a variety of different ways to hold one another and leadership accountable. The first phase is to call within. So each of us needs to look within ourselves, to ask ourselves, how are we showing up in this space? What is our responsibility in any situations of harm that may have occurred? Do we have the capacity to hold someone else accountable? Right? There may be instances in which I have experienced a harm and I call within and I do some self-reflection and I realize, no, Fiona, you are far too traumatized or in too much pain in order to call someone in or out. That has to fall on someone else. So that calling in is the looking inward process. We also understand that calling out, and Jess is our calling out person at Healing Equity United, is a valid strategy, right? Sometimes you have to publicly hold people accountable and name and articulate and identify, look at this messed up stuff that is happening here, because you've tried calling in, you've tried the quiet negotiation, you've tried getting others to get on board, and nothing has shifted. And so, the calling out is a valid strategy. what Jess talked about when she asked me to answer this question was the calling in. And that, I think, particularly works with leadership that has a whole bunch of fragility and fragility issues and a whole bunch of dynamics around power and not wanting to lose power. And so how do we hold leaders accountable? Sometimes you have to look for co-conspirators in the space, other leaders or executive directors, right? Who share the same perspectives that you do, and getting them to talk to leaders, right? Because their voices will be more valued than your own. Another one is to have a coalition of voices within an organization so that it's no one person who is taking a hit, but saying, you know, at this organization, we have noted A, B, and C, and we're wondering if you would be open to changing those dynamics. So those are just some examples. So we wanted to shift to radical healing and how trauma impacts us, because we don't want to just leave it on, oh, we hold so much pain. So we know that trauma impacts us as individuals and members of communities and members of organizations. And we know that we can hold this stuff in our bodies. Personally, I hold it all in my stomach. Oh my goodness. But we know that there are higher rates of gastrointestinal issues, higher rates of high blood pressure, of diabetes. We know that there are emotional and psychological components of holding on to and internalizing racialized trauma. So radical healing is our suggestion. And here's what some of us can do. First of all, each of us has to determine for ourselves what our reoccurring common triggering scenarios are and figure out how we need to address them and heal when those situations occur. I'll give you an example, quick example of what I mean by that. When I was growing up, I went to a predominantly white private school, and in that space, I was often ignored. People didn't call on me. People were really shocked if I gave an quote unquote articulate answer, right? And that made 13-year-old Fiona really angry. As an adult doing service provision in the sector, I was often in spaces where I was rendered invisible, that I was spoken over, that I felt 13-year-old Fiona show up in the space. I had to figure out my own strategy for navigating that very common scenario. Understanding, like I just went through in my process, how I shared that example, I understand the root trauma associated with that scenario. I noted, as I told you earlier, I hold stuff in my stomach. So I would get that knot in my stomach. I would clench my fists, and then creating my own personalized trauma response toolkit so that I can consider how to move forward in those scenarios. So that, sorry, Jess, go ahead.
So we ask you all to take a moment to kind of just consider what might be in your trauma response toolkit, right? And so I want to emphasize here that it's not just what would be in your self-care toolkit, because when you have trauma and trauma compounded, sometimes what's in our self-care toolkit may not work, right? So if my self-care, my regular self-care routine was to read a book or take a hot bubble bath, right? I may not have access to those two things when I'm experiencing trauma or a trigger in a conversation with my supervisor. I might have to pull out something else that I can use in what we call a trauma response toolkit, or what I sometimes call like an emergency self-care practice. And so in that moment, it might be taking a couple of deep breaths, reminding myself that when someone's coming at me, it's not about me, it's about them. That I can be in control of how I react. So just think about what might be in that trauma response toolkit for yourselves.
So why focus on radical healing? We suggest that radical healing is important because it isn't equivalent to self-care, right? It's not about going to get a bubble bath or to get your massage. And not to say anything pejorative about those activities, that's great. But radical healing is about what we resort to, rely on, and utilize when we're talking about issues as extreme as racialized trauma. And so this quote, if you don't heal from what hurt you, you'll bleed on people who never cut you. There's also the one that everybody's familiar with, hurt people, right? And so we need to talk about how radical healing can be used and leveraged to interrupt this cycle of abuse that Jess mentioned earlier, in terms of how it intersects with DV, how it intersects with the oppression that we face as folks of the global majority. And so radical healing involves being or becoming whole in the face of identity-based wounds. That can be associated with our racial identities, our ethnic identities, right? It could also include the way in which our parents or their parents were socialized, right? Like how they had to move through society in order just to survive, right?
So next, we're going to ask you to just share your ideas around what types of radical healing practices you might be able to engage in, either in your workplace or your organization or your department, program, wherever, in your office, wherever that is. And so we invite you to share with us, either by unmuting and sharing, or putting your suggestions into the chat so that we can put some ideas out on the table.
So I really, as more responses come in, I really appreciate, and I can't tell you how much it resonates with what Bella put in the chat, which was dropping the accent. I use an American accent when working with white people. It's exhausting, and now I'm accepting the way I talk, and that I am professional, capable of doing the work regardless of how I sound. You know, what we didn't talk about was that additional burden and toll that this has on us, right? And Bella, I applaud you. That is a form of radical healing. When you say, if I show up as my whole self, that is good enough, that whole self, right? I don't have to put on a facade, right? I don't have to act a certain way, and I don't have to speak a certain way. So I applaud you. Yes, that is certainly an element of radical healing. I'd love to see some others. Oh, okay, there's one in the chat. Being okay with not looking perfect in professional settings. Okay, let me just address this one. And what is professional? And what is professional, and who determined what professional looks like, right? So thank you for putting that in the chat. Whose version of perfect are we trying to attain? I see in the chat, perhaps doing family history. There's a lot of value in that, right? And that can help to make you whole, right? eating my own cultural foods and not feeling the need to apologize and explain. That's right. That's right. That's a form of radical healing, because that's letting go of somebody else's baggage that you are holding. I do want to note, though, that what I've seen here thus far has been focused on the individual. We, as advocates in a sector, need to hold organizations and the sector accountable for providing space for radical healing as well. Jess?
Yeah, so let's talk about this. If your nonprofit were to create that culture, what would be included? How would the activities you're suggesting support racial healing? And how can you take action and accountability? And so let's think about it as an organization. What can we do?
So there are a variety of different things that different nonprofit organizations, particularly those in the DV sector, have started to implement. One, it's quarterly self-care days, right? So we don't have to call in, I have that 24-hour flu. No, every quarter you are given a day that you are required to take off just to focus on your well-being, so that you can show up in a way that allows you to continue to do the work. Other organizations have hired energy healing practitioners and funded them so that staff can go to access energy healing practitioners whenever they like, and they don't have to pay anything. Or yoga practitioners, right? The organization funds the yoga practitioners, and then the staff can access them anytime they like. There are a variety of different things like that. And I see in the chat, allowing people of color to meet without white people having to be involved. Stop being suspicious of people of color collaborating and meeting. You know, wherever more than two people of color get together, there's a revolution happening somewhere, or at least that's the perception. And so thank you for raising that, right? Like, folks can get together to have conversation and be in solidarity with each other and to be free, like that space of liberation, right? Of not having to conform to other people's narratives and assumptions. I see another one, creating policies that allow advocates of color to care for family or offer some flexibility in scheduling. Yes, yes, our circle of family is a lot larger than the typical American family. So thank you for raising that, because, you know, I told y'all that my family's Jamaican American, and I will tell you, we had 4 generations in the house. We had my granny, we had my mom, myself, and my partner, and my kids, right? Because that's how we think of family. It also may include aunties and uncles. It also may include the cousins, some of whom may not be related to you by blood, right? So thinking about policies and infrastructure that accommodates those very lived, real experiences. Jess?
Yeah, so now we want to just open it up for other questions that you might have. Here's our contact information. We have about, I think, 5 minutes left for any questions that we may not have addressed. So we'll give everyone a moment to, you can either raise your hand, unmute and ask us, or you can put it into the chat.
Yes, and I see in the chat someone said creating an actual budget for healing and not just wellness activities. That's absolutely right. Right, so what's the line item that's dedicated to paying for a pod of psychiatrists or therapists if some staff want to use talk therapy? What's the line item and money dedicated to Tai Chi practitioners so that they can be paid to hold space for staff, right? if we're not paying for it, we don't value it. And so as organizations, we have to prioritize how we view radical healing for staff. And that staff is not disposable, right? They're not interchangeable. We have to invest in their well-being and not just in an emergency basis as a stopgap measure.
How much, can you talk about just whatever resistance that you guys face, especially with, there seems to be, I don't want to get too political, but, this whole thing about being woke. And it seems like whenever we're talking about this type of subject, on the other side would come, the resistance would come out, about this, being woke, like it's a bad thing. I'm just curious, your guys' experience with the resistance.
I love that question. So I'm gonna actually, so we have a podcast. I'm just be honest with you. We have a podcast called Woke Isn't Enough. I'm sorry, it's a Friday, y'all. I'm gonna have Fiona actually just give like a very quick background of woke, but of where that came from. But my thing is that like the conservatives, white supremacists in this country have weaponized words like woke and other words that we typically have been using in order to continue pushing their agenda forward. And so that's my personal perspective. And I think we need to reclaim words. And I think we need to also, just like we need to reclaim our history and our land. But that's my perspective. Fiona, what do you think?
So brief history of the word woke. It's been used for decades, primarily by folks in the African-American community. There's even a song that talked about being woke back in the 30s because it was talking about a case in Scottsboro where 3 African-American boys were accused of assaulting a white woman. And he says, the blues singer says, "We all better stay woke. We all better stay woke." And so what Jess is alluding to of reclaiming the language, and Robert, thank you for the question, we get a lot of pushback. And so from my perspective, this isn't about, am I gonna call myself woke or not? This is about a very real lived experience that folks of the global majority have had to face, and simply because we are demanding that other folks acknowledge it and then change their behavior accordingly. That's not about me being woke or not. That's about holding you accountable, right? So, we have set up nonprofit organizations to burn out its staff, right? We have, a higher caseload than we can handle. We have to go to more meetings than we can actually follow up on. We have to answer more calls on hotlines than we can actually do while still maintaining our sanity, right? It is okay to hold organizations accountable and demand that they change their behavior. So thank you for the question, Robert.
So thank you all for joining us today. Our contact information is on the screen. Please contact us if you have other questions. Otherwise, thank you so much for hosting us. And we look forward to seeing you again.